And I should be communicating with
No,
you
no, no, no,
more.
no. I just wanted to make sure,
Sorry.
because
Yeah,
like the whole thing about, I did not want to bring it up.
right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. I like it. I like it. Hi, Lisa. Okay, thank you. So we're waiting on the AV guys. Oh, you're ready to go. Thank you. Okay. And should I wait on Vice Chair Trujillo? It's 10 after. Oh, let him. No, no.
Let me see where she's at.
All right. Oh, that is like, oh, there you were. Anything that requires input from Ms. Bowen, I'll punt on.
Okay.
All right. Let's prepare to begin, please. Eh, I have too many cups.
But I need them.
Yeah. Okay. Good morning to all of you, and thank you very much for beginning early with us. We'd like to press through the day today on the technical case. We'll be taking public comment between 6 and 7 p.m. We're on day 3 now of the joint petition around vehicle emission standards. We had an agreement with Mr. Domenici to present a witness out of order based on time constraints. Following the testimony of Mr. Domenici's witness, we will return to the petitioner's third panel with Ms. Miano, Mr. Copal, and Mr. Lee. Mr. Domenici, if you would, please.
So, Madam Hearing Officer, I might have misunderstood. That single witness is part of a panel, so I was expecting to put that panel on. But if that's going to take too long, then if the other NMED panel is ready, that panel, that'll be one of my main panels. So I would assume there'd be, of course, you can break up cross-examination or do whatever you want, but it would be a 3-person panel.
I see. All right. So let me check with the other counsel. I did misunderstand. I thought it was an individual. Mr. Knight? Yes.
Madam Hearing Officer, yeah, that was our understanding too, that it would be a single witness presented, and then we would be able to get back to questions from the board for our panel so those people could finish up. That was what was asked for, and that was what was agreed to. It was my understanding.
Okay. So, Mr. Domenici, is there a way to present that person as an individual? Because my understanding was that individual has to be gone by 10:30. If we go back to the petitioner's panel, I couldn't say whether you could get through your panel then by 10:30.
I would,
Mr. Bach, please come to the mic.
From our position, we would be comfortable having the panel go if that's the fastest way to do things. I think our biggest concern is making sure that we move everyone along, and because we have a lot of witnesses that still need to get in. So if it's more efficient, that's what we would prefer. But obviously, leave it up to you and the other parties as well.
That's my only interest as well, is just powering through some.
So we would like to do the panel. Of course, if she's cross-examined first or something like that, she could leave. I think her cross-examination might be less than other panel members. But if it would, if Andrew's panel is here, we don't mind if they want to finish up, and if we have less time, we can get that one witness finished. But she has been expecting to testify as part of a panel.
Okay, so what we have left with the petitioner's panel, really is the questioning of 3 board members.
That's okay.
All right.
So that would be fine to finish that up.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Ms. Miano, Mr. Kopal, and Mr. Lee, do we have all 3 of you?
Madam Hearing
Ms.
Officer, I don't think Mr. Lee is here yet. If the boards are comfortable, you know, he didn't get asked very many questions last time, but if they want to answer theirs, and if they still have remaining questions when he joins us, happy to have him go up and answer them.
All right, thank you. I'm sorry if we misled him last night.
No, it's okay. Yeah.
All right.
My name is Kelsey Sona.
Okay. We do, by the way, have a new court reporter today. This is Chris Sanchez of Williams and Associates. And I do try to use people's names when I call on them. If I forget, please identify yourself for the transcript. So, Ms. Miano and Mr. Kopal, if you would. You were. And now you don't have to rush. Good morning. When we broke or interrupted the questioning of this panel, Chair Paul still had questions remaining. We'll then turn to Chair Sweeney and Vice Chair Trujillo. Chair Paul, please.
Thanks, folks, and good morning. I think I just had 4 more questions. We just talked about the agricultural use exemption potentially. Then I heard a lot of questions about a singular citation or a singular sentence of your testimony, Director Miano. Is there any other evidence in your in the docket about manufacturers' plans for EVs that you might want to point to?
Yes. We have in my, let me go to my direct testimony. I would point to NMED Exhibit 4, starting at page 10, page 11, page 12, page 13. I'd also like to point to my rebuttal testimony that has additional information, and that is NMED Rebuttal Exhibit 6.
There were also questions about the road fund or the gas tax. I don't know what we call it, but you know, the funding that we receive from tax on gas at the pump, and how that would decrease if there were fewer gas cars on the road. Are there any plans to, find those funds in other places? How is the state managed? And now I know you're not at EDD, so maybe you're not the right person to ask, but the folks you're the New Mexico Environment Department. You may not be the right person to ask, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about that fund, because it is, of course, important to keep our roads
Sure.
maintained.
Thank you, Chair Paul. I want to note that the gasoline tax, for those that don't know, is a tax of 17 cents per gallon. And that is a tax that is paid for the purchase of gasoline. And so the issue is that the tax that, we all pay when we fill up gasoline, there will be a gap because we will not be taxed, because we will not be purchasing gasoline, and we will not be subject to the fluctuations of higher gas prices and those sorts of issues. It is a consideration that New Mexico is thinking about, and how to address that, as far as making sure that there are enough funds to keep roads in place. There's no proposals at this time, but it's something that we're well aware of. And I know that other states other Section 177 states are considering this issue too, with options for increased fees for an EV registration, or other ways. We were even talking about maybe there's a way that based on weight of vehicle, there could be, additional fees. Everything is under discussion as far as the Section 177 states, as to how to recoup some of the taxes that will be lost because of, New Mexicans and those other state residents will not need to purchase gasoline anymore.
Okay, thank you. I think this was covered a little bit, but just in case it wasn't, we talked a little bit about chargers and the availability of pumps versus the availability of individual plugs. Can you fill in that picture a little bit more for us about the plans at the state and with your sister departments, how in the next 13 years, if this rule were to be enacted, or I suppose it's just 10 years now, I'm living in the past, how that, if there are plans to reach parity in terms of chargers being as easily accessible and available throughout the state as gasoline stations.
That's a great question. Thanks, Chair Paul. We have heard throughout this rulemaking process that one of the advantages of electric vehicles is that you don't have to travel to a gas station to purchase gasoline with these kinds of vehicles. So it upends in many ways what we know and experience now as how we fuel our cars. So there won't be the need for the kinds of gas stations that we have, because we don't have the ability to fill up our internal combustion vehicle engines in our house, obviously. This is going to be an opportunity for anybody who has a battery electric vehicle to actually get that energy from wherever they're living. And so that is a different model than what we have. And so we are looking that, and because we know that 80% of charging occurs at home, and that the utilities are integrating transportation electrification or rebates as part of their transportation electrification plans, we understand that a lot of that fueling up, so to speak, is not going to be in individual locations, but will be where people are living and more localized. That said, we are ensuring that for folks that are, traveling along highways, we have the public investment that is needed to ensure that those travelers can fill up in the because we are used to that instant gratification of putting or filling up our cars with gasoline. We know that there's an expectation that when people travel, they want to fill up their cars quickly with energy, whether it be gasoline or electricity. So we're ensuring that those direct circuit, the DC chargers that fill up cars fast are prioritized as far as state investment to ensure that that fueling up can occur as quickly as possible. And as far as location, I know that there's a lot of consideration about where those chargers are placed. And I know that there's a lot of consideration for corporations and businesses about where they're placing their chargers as well. For example, I know that Walmart is installing chargers at their shopping centers so that, you go in and go shopping, you plug in your car, you pick up what you need, and then you are back at full charge or the charge that you need to get back home. I know that malls are installing them. I know that, we know at the state level, we're looking at installing them at state parks. So if people were visiting the park, they could fill up while they're doing their hiking or recreating. And so we're being very mindful at the state level, and I know that businesses are being very mindful about where to place those chargers, given some of that extra time we know it takes to fill up the vehicles, to make sure that people have those options. And so it's a little bit different than what we know as far as our experiences in all of our lifetimes with filling up our vehicles with gasoline. And so we're being very mindful about those placements and those investments in that transition.
Thank you. The last question is, yesterday we spoke about how many new vehicles are purchased. You had said 60 to 70,000 a year new vehicles.
Yes.
Do you have a figure on used vehicles today?
I don't. I have been informed that it is hard to find that information. And so, all I can say is that we do know that the used vehicle market is more in New Mexico than the new vehicle market, but I don't know exactly how many used vehicles are purchased annually.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Knight.
Could we ask again for an instruction that conversations in the audience be taken out into the hall, because there's it's hard for the court reporter and it's hard for the interpreters otherwise.
All right. Again, our hearing is being transcribed by Mr. Sanchez and simultaneously interpreted by a team of interpreters who are with Ms. O'Grady. And chatter in the room carries further than you might think because of the acoustics in this room, which they've tried to help with these quilts and rugs, but isn't a perfect fix. Add that to the crinkling roof sounds, and we're in a very special place. So thank you, Mr. Knight. Also, please reach for your devices and silence them. I know sometimes we forget to do that. And thank you very much, Mr. Lee, for joining us at the table. There hasn't been a question for you yet, but maybe later. Chair Paul.
I finished my question. Thank you.
You did? All right. Chair Smina.
Yes, thank you so much for coming early on our third day. I have a couple of questions, and this is for Ms. Miano. I know from your resume and your history experience, you have some experience working in tribal and Pueblo country with your previous employment. So I was just wondering, and I think I asked this earlier in these proceedings, how does this rule affect tribal and Pueblo areas? Since it's a state rule, has there been any discussion with like Pueblo leadership or tribal leadership about how to coordinate or how it dovetails or doesn't dovetail with their jurisdictional areas? Like, for example, some may have like treatment as a state for air quality and maybe even water, but in particular air quality. So I was wondering if in your development and the department's development of this rule, if that has ever come into any discussions, and if so, what have those discussions been?
Thank you for that question, Chair Sweeney. We know as a state from speaking with tribal environmental directors that there are limited resources that Pueblos and tribes have. I know that our department has not been shy when we have discussed our limitations when it comes to our budget and our capacity. My experience talking with tribal environmental leaders is that they are even less funded in many ways and have less staff than our understaffed department. And I think one of the Pueblos I had met with their tribal environmental director had just come on board, and that was the first position that they had. We've also heard from tribes and Pueblos that they have been coordinating with EPA because, of course, of that government-to-government relationship. That's a very important relationship to honor, especially as a state government. What we've heard is that EPA is trying, but there is not the resources available as much. And right now I'm talking about those federal funding opportunities that the state is looking at, namely the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant. That's been my, that's been one of my priorities. Talking with other Pueblos and other tribal nations and EPA, talking to the EPA tribal liaisons and those directors for both Region 9 and Region 6, there's full acknowledgement that there's not the funding available for tribes like there is for states. And even though for a lot of these federal fundings or opportunities have both a state track and a tribal track, that does not preclude us from working together. And so one of the things that we have tried to do at the department is coordinate with tribal environmental directors, see what the priorities are for those environmental programs. I know that, for example, in the Navajo Nation, their environmental protection agency is dealing with air pollutants and trying to address monitoring situations like our air agency is. And speaking with them recently, we had a lot of the same experiences trying to make sure we're getting the right data out and being responsive to community concerns. I see us all in a very similar position of trying to obtain the most federal dollars for our governments. And even though the federal government has the tribal track and the state track, I've notified tribal leaders that we would like to work with tribal governments to coordinate on those limitations. For example, with the limited funding available for Region 6, for example, our EPA region, maybe there's a role that the state can play if a Pueblo or a Pueblo, Pueblo consortia applies for the tribal money and it's limited, they can't get it. Let's work together and figure out if we can fold in and coordinate as part of a larger effort, because even with the state track in the Climate Pollution Reduction Act funding, we're not precluded from working with other jurisdictions. And actually EPA has told us that they would like our jurisdictions to work together and do the hard work to make sure that there's connectivity, to make sure that all communities are benefiting from this kind of projects that will both and this is part of the pollution reduction grant again, both reduce emissions, reduce air pollution problems, because we know that our air sheds, although we have jurisdictional divisions, our air sheds are all the same that we're breathing. And so the more we can work together in order to put in some of these applications together and coordinate, I think not only is that the right thing to do for making sure that all of our communities are considered, but it puts us in a more competitive place for EPA, and that's what they're looking for. I think that we've seen from the Pueblos that they've already particularly that they've already taken a very aggressive stance when trying to make the business investments for clean vehicles, and we understand that, that is a disruption from the way that this state has done business in the past. And I think that shows great leadership from the Pueblos, and it's something that, the state would like to further coordinate on. We do also understand as the state, we heard from some of the state representatives that for a very long time in Northwest New Mexico and in some of those jurisdictions that, whether it be Gallup, I think that was, for Senator Munoz or other state representatives, they're telling us that there's a very large gap in terms of infrastructure and electricity and water, and that's occurred in, those legislators' jurisdictions for a very long time. So the state stands ready to work with those legislators to help solve those problems in those districts. We'd love to see and work with those legislators to make sure that the utilities and those areas are getting the resources they need, and we stand ready to work with them to serve those districts. There are a lot of disparities that have happened for a very long time. The state's position is not that we should, again, overlook those communities as we advance towards cleaner vehicles and make those communities go through dirty electricity and dirty vehicles and more pollutants and have to breathe gasoline in order to get to where we're trying to get them. Our intent is that we can bypass that completely and bring them online with programs like the Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department has applied for. The Solar for All program specifically targets those communities that might not have electricity, that might not have the ability to, just have what we're talking about and plug in that vehicle. And so we want to make sure that these funds go everywhere, and we are and will continue to work with Pueblo, tribal, and Native nations to ensure that that's not confined to a state jurisdiction, but that improves well-being and quality of life for everyone.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to, so in all of the docket and some of the information that was provided, I just want to also ask what kind of data sharing, because I noticed that they're on the map where we have chargers. I know that there's some Pueblo areas that have chargers, but they're not on the map.
Yes. There are chargers that I know of that the New Mexico Department of Transportation is working on to install, I think at Jemez and at Picaris. I also know that we need to do a better job of illustrating where those chargers are, because they are coming online so quickly, as we heard in testimony. We have to make sure that we're getting those updates to the map as soon as possible so that people have comfort and knowledge about where to charge once they purchase their electric vehicle.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and that's been one of the concerns that's been brought up. So I just want to make sure that there's data and out there for the public, and for us also to consider of where these chargers are, if there's gaps. Mr. Valdez had said, there's an intent by NMDOT to have a charger every, I think, 50 miles along state and interstate highways. But with that said, I know, as I shared earlier, there's a great deal of federal lands here, and you talked about having chargers at state parks. Is there also, can you explain about collaboration maybe with federal jurisdictions like Forest Service, BLM, National Park Service, about additional charging areas to increase that infrastructure?
Thank you, Chair Sweeney. I know that there are odd legal limitations with easements at travel centers. And so I know that is something that the Department of Transportation here in New Mexico is trying to address. And we know that the federal government is as much on board with this infrastructure investment, of course, with the bipartisan infrastructure law and other federal laws. We know that the federal government wants to make those investments too. And so it is up to us to figure out how to thread that needle to make sure that our chargers are here, under the legal auspices of any easements or that sort of thing, and to work with the federal government to ensure that those chargers are in place. And if they can't be in place for a legal reason, to determine what that legal reason is and correct it, and work with federal partners, because we do have a lot of federal land here in New Mexico. I know that there's a lot of federal land in, for example, Utah, and they have been working to really install chargers at a fast clip. And the states are talking about how we're solving these problems. And so if there's a limitation that we find, we're able to work with other jurisdictions to make sure that we're all benefiting from the lessons learned as we all go through this process that nobody's ever done before.
Thank you. And maybe a little shift in your written testimony, and what Legal Counsel Domenici pointed out earlier in the cross yesterday was about the grant. So I want to shift to some of the grant funding that is in your written testimony. I noted in some of the, in that chart that, and having written a number of grants, I wanted to ask this clarification question. So noted on these grants and in that table, for some of those grant funds, especially some of the bigger ones, that they are quote unquote competitive grants. So would it be your understanding that by being a ACA 2 state, that will help in framing whether or not the state will be more competitive in seeking out that grant funding?
Yes, there are two, as you know, Chair Sweeney, two types of grants. We have the formula funding and the competitive funding. I don't know off the top of my head if there is a way that ACC2 could make us more competitive, but I do know that for my climate pollution reduction grant in our department, that the EPA is looking for investments to make that are amplifying the work that's already being done. And so for that particular grant, that's the one I have knowledge of and that I can speak to specifically. There's so much federal funding flowing into all of the corners of our nation that for the climate pollution reduction grant, EPA specifically looking for where are the dollars not going to, where's that gap, and how can EPA use its federal dollars to amplify what's already happening. So I suspect that passing the proposed rule will place New Mexico and other partners that we work with to submit applications in a more competitive position, because the EPA can see that our region is taking action, is serious about reducing air pollution, which we know we have a problem with, given the testimony. We are an energy producing state. The EPA wants to see states like us what we come up with, what projects we put together, how we can decrease this, what we're doing. And I can only imagine that for a grant like the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant, passing these proposed rules will push us over the edge and make EPA see that, look, this region is doing what it needs to do. We think our federal dollars are best invested there.
Thank you so much for that. And I wanted to kind of shift to what Chair Paul was talking about with the gas tax and the decrease, potential decrease if this rule is passed, with the decrease in what taxes are paid at the, from the pump. Has there been an analysis, like what is there, as you're maybe discussing how how the state will accommodate that shift? Is there like a break-even point where we need to do something by, as a state, by 2027, 2028, where the gas tax revenue goes down, and that we need to kind of level that out? I don't know if there's been that analysis.
I don't have that analysis. I do know that with the gas tax, the burden on paying for roads shifts from gasoline to other places. And so we as a state are going to have to make some decisions about how to make up for that funding. On one side, less tax is great, because that means we're not paying as consumers that tax. On the other hand, we know that we of course need to maintain roads and make sure that people can drive to where they need to drive to for their day-to-day. And so it is something that's under consideration now, and that we're gonna have to make some decisions on as these rules, if they are implemented, go forward.
Thank you for that. And maybe to move a little bit on that, I was wondering, I've heard and read some of the public comments and some of the information in the docket about the weight issues or weight considerations for the EV vehicles, that they're a little bit heavier than ICE vehicles. Some around, I think I read a figure of like 30%. I think it was talked about yesterday a little bit in some of the cross examination. And I was just wondering if there's been any data from other states that have already started this transition about the road issues and the wear and tear, maybe potentially additional wear and tear on roads because of electrical vehicles or heavier vehicles. And I think this might be for Mr. Kopal. Thank you.
Thank you. Good question, and I do want to acknowledge that weight estimates I gave yesterday were low. And as pointed out by the gentleman on the EIB, that the lowest end of the range for weight increase is about 300 pounds in the market, which is what I was quoting, but the typical weight is about 1,000 pounds. And I think, and I address this in my rebuttal testimony, there's two things I want to point out. The first is that industry recognizes that this is an issue. There's developments underway. In fact, as I mentioned in my rebuttal testimony, Ford, Toyota, Nissan, and BMW are developing solid-state battery technology to be introduced as early as model year 2025, with the potential to cut the battery weight by 2/3 and to increase driving range. And then in addition, because we know that battery density and battery capacity continues to improve as it has, I think industry is recognizing that this needs to be addressed. And I think we've seen the innovation in industry, rising to the challenge, and I think that's well underway. And so I don't think that this is a static situation, right, where this weight difference will always be there for EVs. But certainly it is the case now. The other thing I point out in my rebuttal testimony is that increased weight from cars and light trucks on roads is not unique to EVs. We've seen an increase in car and light truck weight of 25% over the past 40 years because of this shift from cars to SUVs and light trucks. The roadways are designed for fully loaded semi-trucks, 80,000-pound trucks. And so, in terms of any sort of, recognizable damage or catastrophic damage to the roadway, I mean, the roadways are already absorbing the weight increase that we've seen on light-duty vehicles, and they're designed for these heavy trucks. And as I say in my rebuttal testimony, and I cite a study on this, that a heavy truck, 80,000-pound heavy truck, causes 2,500 times the road damage of a 4,000-pound car and truck. So it's not even in proportion to the weight. It's an exponential increase. And so when we're designing roads and bridges for those trucks, the weight increases we're talking about from today's EVs, are not, in that order of magnitude. I'm not aware of any studies in states that have been able to look at this. I think it's probably very difficult to parse out because, people are driving, 10,000-pound pickup trucks, and already, on the roads. And so, how do we sort of assign an increase of 1,000 pounds, of a certain, sector of vehicle? How do we look at that so far? So I think I'm not aware of any studies. I think industry does recognize that this is an issue that really has to be addressed for EVs, and I think the technology is on the way to reduce the weight.
Thank you for that, and that additional explanation. Let me see if there's, I think I want to, Mr. Kopal, I wanted to go back to some of your slides and your testimony, the written testimony, and I know there's some projections out from in your slides about the benefits of going to electrical vehicles, the cost benefits for the individual, cost benefits for the state. And I noted that, some of those models or those estimates went out to 2050. Right. And I was just wondering what the assumption is as you model out from 2032, because that's what I understand this rule is going up to in terms of the 80-some% at 2032.
Right.
So what's the, the gap between 2032 and 2050? What is the assumption in terms of vehicle? Is it staying at 80-some? Okay.
Yeah, that's what we assumed for. We call that the market scenario, where we just assume that the market stays stable after model year 2032.
Okay. And so going out to 2050, if we're able to stay, I know in one of the slides there was let me pull up my notes here, an estimate that climate damage is avoided at 1.1 to 3.5 billion in 2050. I think it was on one of the slides. And you said it was not specific to New Mexico. Was it specific to the country, or was it globally?
Well, that's that's the social cost of carbon estimate, which is based on, so that the emission reductions are specific to the New Mexico program. The benefit of, from the climate, I think, it's difficult to put a bound on geographically, right? Because it's, and so I don't, so, all I can say, it's not specific to New Mexico. It's sort of, I think, considered, I know US EPA, when EPA does social cost of carbon, they sort of attribute it to, the nation. But also with some recognition that, of course, not all the climate impacts are just going to happen within the neat bounds of the country, right? So I think it's probably more safe to say it's a global, sort of a global effect.
Thank you for that. And want to jump a little bit, Mr. Kopal, to what Member Lewis was talking about mining and the full cycle impacts of battery. I know you mentioned a little bit and talked about that yesterday during your testimony and in your written testimony. Is your analysis and maybe industry analysis industry looking at the full cycle impacts, including disposal of batteries like lithium, and what to do with the waste of lithium batteries? I assume we can't just toss it out at the the normal county landfill. And I don't know if it's between you, Ms. Miano, or Mr. Kopal.
I do know, so as I mentioned yesterday, so our analysis looks at fuel cycle emissions, so, you know, the kind of the extraction and the production and distribution of gasoline versus the, you know, the generation of electricity. So that's a well-to-wheel or fuel cycle. Our analysis did not cover the full life cycle or vehicle life cycle. However, we did look at, you know, anticipating this question, we did include a sensitivity analysis in our documentation where we took an estimate, and this is more sort of, and I'm not sure, to be honest, how it deals with the back end, the disposal side. But the estimates in terms of the production of the minerals, you know, and the mining of the minerals and the production and the battery production. So we looked at a study that was published by the International Council on Clean Transportation, which had estimates of greenhouse gas emissions per kilowatt hour of battery capacity. And they had estimates specific to the US, China, and Europe. And so for a US battery, you know, based on where it's sourced, as we mentioned in our docketed material, you know, we found, and we didn't do a full life cycle analysis, which would include, you know, not just looking at this for the EV, but of course, you know, the internal combustion engines also have vehicle life cycle emissions as well. And the studies do show, and I think this is acknowledged, that, you know, currently the battery production emissions are higher than the internal combustion. But when we look at the battery production emission estimate, you know, and don't look at the internal combustion engine, so it's just sort of a maximum, you know, kind of a worst case. You know, we estimated that it would reduce our greenhouse gas benefits by about 5%. So it's a very minimal impact. And what's interesting is I also looked at comments that were submitted by the American Fuel and Petroleum Manufacturers, and they included a detailed study for the California, so it's not, you know, specific to New Mexico, but it's for California. But it looks at the same, it was a study done by Ramble, you know, another environmental consulting firm. And they also looked at, you know, the life cycle impacts of different implementation of different, you know, different EV strategies, et cetera. And they also included a case with and without the upstream, the battery cycle production. And, you know, I don't have the specific number, you know, I was trying to pull it off charts, but, you know, but I was able to sort of roughly calculate that it's of a similar magnitude. I would say, you know, less than 10% of the greenhouse gas benefit, you know, would be lost, I think, due to. So it's interesting that, you know, not only our own analysis based on International Council on Clean Transportation, which is, you know, reputable international organization, but also it conforms with data that was presented by the American Fuel and Petroleum Association in their comments as well. So I'm, you know, and clearly, I mean, this issue has to be addressed going forward in terms of the broader life cycle impacts. But I think based on these two, you know, independent estimates, you know, it gives us some sense that, you know, this is not, you know, not going to overwhelm the benefits of the program, right, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So.
Thank you for that, Mr. Copal. And I think for NMED, I was wondering if there's been discussion about, you know, the disposal costs and places where lithium batteries, as one of the cradle to grave considerations for any new technology. You know, sometimes we think it's the next best thing, and then we're at the end of the cycle and we're trying to figure out what to do with the waste. And so I just wanted to see if NMED has had any discussions or plans for how to address the waste of, in particular, lithium batteries.
Thank you, Chair Sweeney. It is a topic of much discussion, not just in the lithium battery realm, but in all of the manufactured and produced commodities that we use in our day-to-day lives. We find that the manufacturers and companies produce these items, and then we as the government are largely responsible for cleaning them up. And I know there's a movement to ensure, and I think this is particular to plastic, that the companies that produce large, produce waste are responsible for their waste cradle to grave. And I know that from my conversations, there is more than I've ever seen companies taking ownership over that issue. Even in Los Angeles earlier this year, I listened to a panel of major corporations developing their own programs for waste, their own programs for taking back the waste after their products are used. And so I am hopeful that the auto manufacturers, and with these new technologies, there are recycling programs and other programs that can be created to solve this problem. And I know that a lot of companies are moving in that direction. I also know that for disposal, for waste currently, our New Mexico Environment Department spends a lot of time and a lot of taxpayer money cleaning up waste from the oil and gas industry, whether that be in our Petroleum Storage Tank Bureau. I know this is not unique to the New Mexico Environment Department. I know the federal government spends a lot of time cleaning up spills and those sorts of items. So we think that there's a benefit there moving to this technology, especially with a movement with businesses considering their own waste streams. I also learned as part of this process that with a battery, even though the battery of the car might not, or the battery in the car might not have enough life to power the car, that battery can actually be used to power other things. And so it might not have enough energy to power the car, but it could be repurposed and recycled to provide other kinds of power sources. And I know there's a lot of folks working on that issue as well to make sure that we don't make the same mistakes that we did with internal combustion fuel vehicles and gasoline and diesel development.
Thank you so much, and Madam Hearing Officer, that's all I have for right now.
Thank you very much. Vice Chair Trujillo.
Thank you, and I'm going to kind of follow up on Phoebe's question, even though it's a little out of order from where I was going to go. Ms. Miano, when we did, and I understand that you were not an employee of NMED during Clean Cars 1, but this board specifically asked NMED at that time to have some thoughts on plans for disposal of these batteries. And I'm curious if that has followed through in some way, because I have not seen anything in any reports or any evidence submitted so far. And I understand the answer that you gave Chair Sweeney. I'm sorry, did I call you Phoebe? Chair Sweeney on the workings of NMED when it comes to disposal and cleanup of things. But we are very, and I am very curious about the actual plans that are being developed for disposal of these batteries.
Thank you, Chair Sweeney. Thank you, Member Trujillo. It is something that we do not at NMED have definitive plans for, but that we can continue to look at as these rules roll out, as we move towards that model year 2027 timeline. We need to make a lot of preparations to ensure that what we have control over here at the department and at the state, we're addressing the issues that you raise, and we don't make the same mistakes that we did with fossil fuel and internal combustion vehicles and waste streams.
Thank you for that answer. I'm going to pivot real quick. I'd like to ask Mr. Leith some questions. And I'm curious about some of the things about transportation challenges in Albuquerque. And if this is a little bit out of your space, that's totally okay. I'm just trying to, I moved from southern New Mexico up to Albuquerque. So I am learning about a totally different city than I once knew. So I'm curious about some of the challenges that the city of Albuquerque is facing as far as transportation. If you can like give me a broad view of what some of those challenges are.
Is there any particular aspect of transportation that you're interested in learning more about, or just all of the above?
Well, in general, I'm sure there's probably like top 3 things that are really challenging in Albuquerque for people to get around, for just transportation in general. So you want to limit it to like the top 1 or 2, 3 things. That's fine.
Well, to the best of my knowledge, one of the most challenging aspects, especially this has been a issue since the pandemic, is for our transit department, ABQ Ride. They've had many issues and struggles trying to hire drivers and mechanics, and they've had to unfortunately cut service and other maintenance issues with their buses because of those employee shortages, and they've been working tirelessly to find ways, increasing pay, other benefits to increase the number of drivers and mechanics, and they've had some recent successes, but unfortunately they're still at a reduced schedule for their bus service. However, they are currently in the middle of doing a complete redesign of the transit system, and hopefully when that is complete sometime next year, they will be able to provide a higher level of service than they are currently, and I think that is a hopeful trend that they are actually, their mitigation efforts to try to increase the number of drivers and mechanics is working, and that will coincide with also an improved service network that they can provide to all the people in the city, especially the disadvantaged communities, which they are prioritizing in their redesigned service network. So when that debuts next year, hopefully those 2 trends will coincide into a more efficient and better transit service. You asked for top 3, so.
Well, actually, that leads
Yeah,
right
so-
into like my next question.
Sure.
I'm really curious about the public transportation, public transit portion of this, and that, and those reductions on emissions in the city. And I read an article recently. I saw or heard it on the radio, and so I looked it up and read it. It was about the Zero Fare program.
Yes.
And admittingly, I didn't know anything about it, and it sounded like, based on the article, that public transportation in Albuquerque was really ramping up. But I kind of got the impression from your statement that it's struggling with finding people, and I think that's pretty common right now of finding employees, and that it's operating at a reduced schedule. So I am kind of curious, what are those challenges that program is facing with reaching people? Is it just unable to maintain a full schedule? What would make people in Albuquerque use public transportation more often?
So the Zero Fares program that you had mentioned, the City Council did just a few days ago, or I think late last week, did approve permanent zero fares for all of ABQ Ride's services moving forward. So I think that's a big win for the transit department and for the city. That program has generally been very popular throughout the city, and since the pandemic, when ridership plummeted due to many known factors, the trend has been upward for ridership since that point, every month since then. So, and some routes, they are nearing the pre-pandemic ridership. And I think especially that Zero Fares program is very beneficial to many of those underserved communities, which will have greater access to the bus service, as well as one aspect that is not talked about is that the Zero Fares program does speed up existing service because it eliminates the need for individual riders to present passes or pay fares at the fare box when they enter the buses. So that is also a big benefit of the Zero Fares program.
Has the city done any sort of modeling on reductions in emissions based on some of these programs that they're implementing for public transportation?
I'm not aware of any greenhouse gas emissions estimates strictly from Zero Fares. They certainly have done modeling for their zero emissions transition study, which I had mentioned in my testimony, where they're looking at both cost, operational, and also environmental benefits of transitioning the bus fleet to zero emissions buses. And those numbers, I don't have any summary of those numbers, but you can find all that information in their study, which is accessible to the public.
Okay, and just one last question for you. Do you feel that implementing this rule or this proposed rules will change the efforts in public transportation?
Yes, I think the requirements and mandates of particularly the Clean Trucks rule will benefit both the availability and impetus for transit systems not only in Albuquerque but throughout the state to transition to lower and zero emission buses, which I think is a good thing and will benefit both the environment and the climate in the state.
Okay, thank you for your time. Madam Hearing Officer, do we need to take a break for public comment?
No, we do not.
Okay, great, so I'll just keep going. Thank you. I have some more questions of, let's see here. Mr. Kripal, did I pronounce your name right? Okay, thank you. I'm curious if ERG conducted similar reports as you created for other states that went through similar rulemaking process.
Good question. So I'm thinking because the kind of the the way that our analysis came about was sort of building on prior work that was done, commissioned by the International Council on Clean Transportation, ICCT, and was performed by a different consulting firm, Sonoma Technology, and they have done this analysis for multiple states. I think, nearly all the Section 177 states, both for ACC and for the ACT rule and omnibus. And so I can't speak specifically to the ins and outs of every state, but this is the first state where we've kind of taken that on. So we sort of took their work, as I laid out in the report. We started with their work and then adapted it to the updates to the rule, and then, extended it, as I mentioned, to 2050 and made some other modifications. But short answer is, no, this is the first time we've kind of done a full analysis for a specific one, Section 77 state related to the benefits of the program.
Okay. Well, my follow-up question, I assumed that you had made more than this report. So my follow-up questions are about assumptions made and lessons learned. And so I guess if you can answer that to the best of your ability.
Assumptions made and lessons learned. I'm drawing a blank a bit on that. I mean, can you sort of
That's
help
okay.
me out of it?
We can move on to some other things.
I mean, do you want me to sort of just talk about kind of the modeling method and like the assumptions that go behind it? Because I can certainly speak to that.
Actually, I have some questions on the modeling, so we can just
sure.
move on.
Okay.
Yeah. Actually, wanted to ask about on page 26 of your report. So 26 of Exhibit 47. There's a chart. And I think we've discussed this chart. I think Mr. Domenici has some questions on it as well. I believe it's page 40 if you're in the PDF.
And by the way, I do want to clarify that when I mentioned the ICCT and Sonoma work, that was specific to the environmental modeling that I was talking about. Yeah, so, okay.
Or, I'm sorry, it's page 41 if you're in the PDF version of it.
The figure 4?
It's
Or-
actually table 22. It's
Okay.
on page 27 of Exhibit 47.
Okay, I see it, yes.
Okay, so what I gleaned from this was that this is over a 10-year period was based on. And so I'm curious if how long does the average New Mexican hang on to a car?
I can't answer that specifically for New Mexico. I know, nationwide, it's longer than 10 years.
It's longer than 10 years?
Yeah.
Okay. You mentioned about the savings that the savings was the same no matter the person's income. And so I'm looking at this chart, I'm wondering, the average cost of the car that was used in this table was $48,000, I think. Around $48,000, or $43,000 and $47,000. So like in that range. And I'm curious, what kind of payment is that for a household? Like,
what sort of payment is the incremental cost, or what sort of payment is the base?
no, what I'm getting at here is that, and I'm pulling a whole lot of information together since I was the last one to go today, or for all this panel, is that we have, I looked at the inputs into REMI, and I don't see any, or RMEI, sorry, and I don't see that any indication was for any inputs were for income. So I'm wondering, like, for residents of New Mexico, so how does one afford a $45,000 car payment and have an average income of $50,000?
I guess maybe 2 points on that. I mean, so first, as I mentioned yesterday in testimony for the REMI modeling, that was based on a baseline of New Mexico income that was developed based on data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. The total cost of ownership, I mean, I think, in terms of the question, I mean, again, I think in a lot of, I think there can be a lot of comments that are sort of pointed at EVs, but need to also recognize the same issue exists for gasoline vehicles. I mean, the same issue exists for gasoline vehicles as well.
I agree.
so-
I've seen the $80,000 vehicles for sale, so I
Right.
understand that.
Yeah, and so I think, and again, I mean, I think just to be clear, the rule, I mean, of course, as we all understand, is not requiring purchase of new vehicles. And so, so in a way, I mean, maybe I'm not understanding your question, but I just want to sort of be clear that it's, we're not like in our table 22, we're not speaking to the question of affording a vehicle. I mean, that's not, the total cost of ownership, I mean, that's sort of, and, the total cost of ownership could be applied to, a used vehicle, a used EV versus a used gasoline vehicle. I mean, it could sort of shift according to the range of the type of vehicle that's being purchased. But I think really this is just meant as a base case to say, if we look at, the current increases in EV cost, which are expected to also come down along with battery weight, as I mentioned before, as battery costing decreases. But based on manufacturer's suggested retail price, that's what this analysis is based on. If we look at the increase in vehicle cost and we look at, the charging cost and kind of all the things listed here, on a relative basis, do we see a savings or do we see an increase? And so that's what this analysis is pointing to, and not really addressing the question of affordability. But I guess I would also say that the question of affordability, is not specific to EVs. I mean, it's, specific to, any income strata in terms of the vehicle being purchased. But I guess I would also turn that around and say that the total cost of ownership analysis, fuel, whether it's a cheap used vehicle or an expensive, luxury vehicle, comparing gas and EV on either side, if you assume that the EV vehicle is more expensive, along the lines of what we're showing here, the fuel still needs to be purchased, maintenance still needs to be done, electricity will still be need to be put into the vehicle. And when you look at the balance of those, the fuel savings outweighs the costs. We're looking at one specific case here, but I think that conclusion would apply to the range of vehicle prices and even into used vehicles.
Okay.
And again, this does not include any tax breaks. This is before any sort of tax credits, for new vehicles or otherwise.
Well, and I believe Miano? There we go. Miano had a chart in her testimony, and it was page 16 of Exhibit 14. It was figures 3 and 4, which show the cost, over time of owning an EV versus an ICE. And although I think that what I kind of gleaned from that was, that over time the EV would be a better purchase than the ICE. So I'm trying to draw all these things together to help kind of paint this picture, but for myself, of why not let the market take care of bringing more EVs in, because I don't have an EV, but I'm almost sold on one after this hearing. So, it sounds like a great way to go. So why not let the market just take care of itself in this?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Vice Chair Trujillo. There are certain times when the market needs to be corrected, and this is one of those times. And why it's one of those times is we have seen from this experience, from even just our testimony this morning, that the current availability of internal combustion engines, the existing availability of internal combustion engines, the existing availability of public transit, it needs to be improved. Public health metrics need to be improved, and climate change needs to be addressed. And the market isn't acting fast enough, and is not creating as much certainty as needed to solve these problems as quickly as we need to solve them. This is why the governments are proposing this rule to accelerate the market. We know from what we've heard that the auto dealers, New Mexico residents, everybody's in agreement that we're all moving into this direction anyway. It's not moving fast enough to address the environmental and public health problems that we have. And we as a government have the ability to provide certainty to the auto manufacturers in a time of uncertainty at the federal level. We can join the other Section 177 states and create certainty for the auto manufacturers that says, regardless of the federal political wins or who wins 2024, we're telling you, auto manufacturers, that there's a market for these EVs. We know people want them. They're going to improve our environment. They're going to improve our health metrics. The total cost of, when you buy a car, even at that expensive price, that's not factoring in all the costs that the state has to pay, all the health bills that, our families have to pay. We need a correction to make sure that we are indicating to the auto manufacturers that there is, that the states, that the governments, the Section 177 states have determined this is the best path for the residents and for, the communities that we have the mission to serve. And this is the time to pull the lever to ensure that the auto manufacturers know that we want those vehicles here, that there's a market for them here, that we're hearing people can't get the base models here. And regardless of the federal level, it's our way of providing the certainty and surety for manufacturers that there is a market. It's meeting them where they are in some instances, but whoever wins in 2024 at the federal level, we don't know what that's going to be. They want certainty for their plans. They have, as we heard, to put in business plans in place about where to deliver their vehicles. Regardless of what happens at the national level, we want to make sure that those manufacturers know that us as states want these vehicles, and it's the right option for how we see the outcomes of increasing vehicles for our residents.
And thank you for that answer. And I'm curious, what keeps New Mexico from writing their own rule that fits New Mexico's economy and applying for their own waiver through EPA?
That's a great question, Vice Chair. The way the Clean Air Act is written, we as a state, we only have two options, and that's under federal law. So we can either accept what the federal government tells us to do, or we can accept what California tells us to do. At this point, we have looked and made the determination that we would like to choose, based on what we've been talking about through this rulemaking, along with the other Section 177 states, the California path. It gets us to where we need to be quicker, both for environmental and health outcomes. And California is a huge market for cars. And so with all the states, with all the Section 177 states, we estimate that New Mexico is a small market. We estimate that we are about 40% of the market for the auto manufacturers. And so it shifts Instead of the federal government being the leader, us joining California shifts California being the leader when it comes to talking to the auto manufacturers and how quickly that they move and how quickly that the states are expecting action to happen. Unfortunately, the Clean Air Act does not allow for states other than California to make those decisions and chart those paths. But what we can do is we can, like we've been having in this discussion, put in certain other laws and policies and directives that are apart from the from the proposed rules that are specific to New Mexico for the New Mexico resident. And this is why we have talked, to all kinds of folks that have been participating in this rulemaking. This is why we've talked to the auto dealers to hear what their comments have been. This is why, we've been talking to them for several months now about what they expect for their consumer base. This is why the Governor Lujan Grisham and the Taxation and Revenue Department are introducing the tailored state tax credits particular to the New Mexico market. So, for example, we can't include conventional hybrids in our following of the California rule, but we can tailor certain things to New Mexico to make this work for the New Mexico consumer. And we've heard those concerns, and we have proposed policies to alleviate those concerns. Especially, we've heard a lot about conventional hybrids from the auto dealers, and so we've included that in our proposal for this upcoming legislative session.
Okay. And thank you for answering that so fully. And I think that's the last question I have for you. I had one follow-up question for Mr. Kopal. On page 40 of your report, Exhibit 47, you make a statement about, and I'll read the statement. It says, "These trends are only due to direct changes from the implementation of the proposed rules and do not depict the overall trajectory of the state's GDP, employment, gross output, and personal income. Rather, these trends show deviations from the baseline." And my question for you is, when you make that statement about deviations from the baseline, was that calculated and is it included in the report? Is that deviation significant?
I think what this is referring to, deviations from the baseline, is really sort of reflected in figure 4 on the next page. So it's, what we're saying is we are using an economic model that was calibrated based on New Mexico specific information, as I mentioned, from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. But we're not doing an analysis to say, here's our overall economic projection, for the entire economy of New Mexico. We're basically saying, okay, just based on, this baseline that we have based on, use the word baseline, based on data we have from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, if we just look at, this rule, the impacts of this rule, the costs, the savings, et cetera, how does that kind of change things relative to the baseline? And so the deviations from the baseline, I think, I interpret that, and that's really the lines on the chart, right? So it's employment is increasing, that's a deviation from the baseline employment. Personal savings are increasing, that's a deviation from the baseline. As I mentioned in my testimony, we see an initial increase in GDP and output, based on the purchase of electric vehicles and charging infrastructure. That's a deviation from the baseline of those, and then those drop, within 1% as savings are, assuming savings are held on to. And so the deviations from the baseline are really just sort of, how does this specific rule, the inputs and outputs of the costs and savings, how does that, change the, kind of the baseline case, really, is all I can say. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
And that's the end of my questions.
Thank you, Vice Chair Trujillo. Member Lewis, I believe you're on the platform and you have a question.
Yes, thank you. Director Miano, I wanted to get a little more explanation of the expectations for compliance, what the data were that led to proposed penalties, what information we have from any other states, or even it's probably too soon to have data from the first Clean Cars bill. But can you talk a little bit about your expectations for compliance and enforcement if companies do not provide the projected volume of vehicles?
Thank you, Member Lewis. We have not heard from any auto manufacturer that they will not be able to meet this rule at all. With all the flexibilities that are in the rule as far as how they can meet their percentage requirements over time, that has been received positively by the Auto Manufacturers Association, and as a benefit to them. That said, all the other states that might not have those early action credits, we have not heard from anywhere that the auto manufacturers are not going to be able to meet these requirements. And that's including the statements that we heard yesterday from, and that are made in the rebuttal testimony from the auto dealerships, which with many of them, if you look closer, actually support the Environment Department's position, which is that the auto manufacturers are still on track, even if there is a delay, to meet their commitments. That said, being in the environmental regulated, business here, there are times when we know that businesses aren't able to meet those requirements. And so in order to ensure that they do, we have to put in, with all of our regulations, I would call it a stick. Please do this or else. And so that or else piece, for purposes of this rule, is enforcement mechanisms available to the New Mexico Environment Department under the Air Quality Control Act. And that's a range of remedies, including fines. And so in the event that the auto manufacturers are unable to meet their delivery requirements to New Mexico, which we do not anticipate happening, there will be, of course, as with any failure to follow a requirement, remedies to the department under the Air Quality Control Act.
And can you elaborate on what those are?
Yes, there are our remedies under the Air Quality Control Act range from any kind of remedies you would have in any, regular enforcement proceeding, ranging from injunctive relief, meaning non-monetary relief, to monetary penalties. I believe under the Air Quality Control Act, they're $15,000 per violation, or per day per violation. I can't recall directly off the top of my head.
And in previous instances, has that indeed been enforceable? I mean, have people responded to those fines? I'm trying to get a sense of how big your stick is, I guess, is the question.
Yes, that's a good question. For this particular rule, and for the Advanced Clean Car rule, or the Advanced Clean Cars program, Advanced Clean Trucks program that we're proposing here, those have not been enforced yet. And so there is a big question on this particular rule about, how those enforcements will occur across all Section 177 states, because this is such a new program. I think that for purposes of New Mexico and our Air Quality Control Act, of course, we have used the Air Quality Control Act to enforce against air quality emissions violations. In this administration particularly, that has been a key part of ensuring that New Mexicans are able to breathe clean air, increase the quality of air that we do breathe, and make sure that companies are held in compliance with the rules that we have on the books. And I think you'll find under this administration, we've had historic settlements and historic enforcement actions, and to address air quality concerns and air quality violations. And in the next 3 to 6 months, those are expected to increase.
And so you're thinking, part of the remedy for a lack of compliance then would be an initial individual fine process or penalty process, including fines. And should compliance not occur, then we would be looking at a court case settlement with industry. Am I capturing that correctly?
That is what we have used in the past under the Air Quality Control Act, and so likely there'll be similar, if it comes to that, which we don't anticipate it will.
Yeah, sure.
There'll be similar enforcement mechanisms available to us to make sure that the manufacturers are complying with our rule.
Okay, thank you. And I just wanted, Mr. Capel, just a couple of clarifications. One on your discussion of the differential weight issues. And I agree for any individual car relative to an 80,000, the 80,000 figure, the number is small. But if we're looking at shifting an entire individual residential level fleet, those numbers get much more impressive. And if we think about like the issue with the bridge fire recently in LA, where their estimate was 300,000 vehicles a day on one bridge, and 300,000 times 1,000 differential, you're now starting to get to a point where that is a major difference. And I just wondered if your perspective on the weight impacts over time multiplied by the number of vehicles that are increasing that weight might change.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I guess 2 points on that. As I mentioned, the increased weight is something that, we do not think, and, sort of based on industry projections and industry's, announcements about forthcoming research and development and products, we do not think this is a long-term issue for EVs. We do see on the horizon technologies being brought to market that will, as I mentioned, solid-state batteries for, that several manufacturers are in development and looking at putting in production in the next few years. Will reduce battery weight by 2/3. We do see sodium-ion technology that can reduce, not as drastic a weight loss, but there's one in production in China that is able to reduce weight by 30%. And so, and manufacturers overall realize they have to reduce this. So I don't, based on, actual market projections and announcements from manufacturers and just sort of the general sense that manufacturers know they have to reduce weight, I really think that it's reasonable to believe that this weight gap will be closed. But that said, the truck number that I mentioned before, 2,500 times the damage of a 4,000-pound vehicle. I mean, there's enough heavy trucks on the road, to sort of, still make that the driving force, I think, in terms of road design and bridge design. So, I really feel like the idea of, large, long-term, road damage or bridge damage is really speculative at this point. I mean, I don't feel like it's, based on sort of, looking at the road dynamics, looking at road design, looking at any studies of this, and also, not taking into account sort of the improvements that are already on the way in terms of battery weight.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. And my last point is just to emphasize the mining question that I brought up initially. Several other people have also raised it, and the discussion to this point really has focused on the grave side of the cradle to grave question. And I think my concern for communities and for air quality from all of the work that we've done is more heavily based on the cradle side. And so I would just urge NMED in developing potential policy submissions to the legislature to focus on that mining side, because the waste that gets left in these communities from that cradle end of this whole process is what ultimately breaks down over time into the nanoparticulates that we're dealing with today in the dust storms. So, if we could just shift that thinking, not to ignore the grave side, but the cradle side is equally important. And that's all I have, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Member Lewis. Any other questions, or can we excuse this panel? Oh, Member Garcia?
Yes, thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. One of the questions I have for Director Miano is, I think it's Director Miano, is I know that you all have talked to other 177 states and probably looked at some of the problems they have encountered since they've enabled this rule. And one of the things I'm hearing about with friends in California who have EVs is, of course, there's not enough chargers. It seems to be a universal problem. But also, once they get to a charger, somebody has parked their car there, left it charging, and then walked away. You suggested earlier at national parks, state parks, maybe they could park it and go for a hike. Well, that could be a big problem if somebody else wants to come along and use that charger. So have you thought about incorporating, and I don't know if you guys would be the one to enforce this, but incorporating rules or somehow penalties so that if somebody leaves their car parked at a charger all day long and prevents other people from being able to use it, are you all thinking about ways to deal with that? I think in California they have talked about increasing the charging cost, tripling it if somebody leaves their car parked when nobody else can use that charger. So what are the plans for instances like that?
Member Garcia, that's a great question. On the chargers, the public chargers specifically, there are, and I'm not sure if folks are familiar, but you actually have a app on your phone, very much like a gas station, where your gas pump clicks, and then that's when you know that you're finished filling up your gasoline tank. With the electric fueling, obviously you don't have that click that tells you that you're finished, but you do have a notification that the charging station sends you. And, we can't police everything at the Environment Department. We hope that folks would adhere to that click, a virtual click on their phones, just like you'd be at a gas station and all the gas pumps are filled and everybody's parked in front of the gas pumps and people are inside buying, coffee or snacks or that sort of thing, and you throw your hands up in the air and, you're like, oh my gosh, I need to go, I can't fill up my gas pump. We hope that folks will take personal responsibility when they get that message that their car is finished refueling to, go back and remove their car for the next person to refuel. In the event that that doesn't happen, you're right, there could be a similar situation like you would have at a gas station where all of the pumps are full. We have not had that problem here that we have heard as part of this rulemaking. And so I'm really glad that you brought that up for future state, in the future. It's a great consideration about when we do get to the point in the future when we have more EVs, what remedies can we have, whether that be Environment Department or maybe Department of Transportation or other, local jurisdictions. It's a great consideration about how we're going to approach that.
Thank you. That's all.
Oh, Member Ely.
Yeah. Just one real quick follow-up question, kind of related to Vice Chair Trujillo Davis's question regarding the market. And is there, and it may be directed to Director Miano or Mr. Copel, but is there any evidence of greater market penetration of EVs in existing 177 states that have adopted the ZEV requirements?
Thank you, Member Ely. We don't know offhand. For a lot of the cars coming in, we anticipate there being a difference that you can see probably in that model year 2026, 2027 timeframe. And so that's going to be a very interesting time to see how the manufacturers deliver.
So are you saying it's too early to tell because we're not in the compliance year yet?
Correct.
But are early action credits bringing in more ZEVs? Do you know?
I do not know.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. I think we can excuse the panel at this. Oh, Mr. Domenici?
Could I follow up on some of the new topics?
Oh, on which topic?
On some of the questions that are new.
Yeah, so remember we still have your panel to get to before 10:30, and I thought the party questioning was over.
Well, I think after.
Come to the podium.
After this breadth of questioning, I think I should be entitled to have a few questions. And if my panel has to reschedule, we're willing to do that
All right.
to make sure we finish with this panel.
All right. If you would please keep it brief.
Put that letter. So, Ms. Miano, really, I'm just going to focus on two questions. First, are you familiar with the comment from Wanda Johnson that's been submitted to the record?
No.
Do you know Wanda Johnson?
Yes.
Do you agree that she represents McKinley and San Juan County?
That is my understanding.
And there was an entire line of questioning from Chair Sweeney about the communications and the arrangements made by the department, and this letter completely contradicts that testimony.
Mr. Bach, I'm sorry, I have to have you come to the podium.
Yeah, we would object. This letter was not discussed at all by any of the questioning. If you want to introduce it into evidence, the way to do that is through your own witnesses.
Yeah, so Mr. Domenici, I am trying to keep this moving, and I understand this may contradict something that was said in response, but is there any reason you couldn't elicit this through your own witness? Wait, unless you come to the podium, I can't hear you.
I mean, the reason would be that his witnesses are not qualified to present on it. And if that's the choice that they made, that's fine, but they should not be abusing the cross-examination process to introduce to information that they can't introduce the correct way.
Right. I'm just trying to balance the breadth and extent of the board questioning in the event there was something else to elicit.
This goes exactly to the questioning of Chair Sweeney, and of course, that's valid cross-examination. The fact that it's an exhibit, it's actually a comment in the docket. The fact that I mean, if we're going to say you can't use, I'm not quite clear why I couldn't use this letter to cross-examine this witness. There's no requirement to pre-disclose cross-examination witnesses. This topic was not raised on direct by NMED. This was raised by Chair Sweeney. She probably asked at least 20 questions about this, and there were minutes and minutes of testimony about we're talking with the tribes about this, about that. This is exactly a response from the representative from that district that has those tribal members. So if you don't accept it, then I would like to make an offer of proof and continue with my questioning.
All right. So insofar as it's part of the record already, I don't think you need to make an offer of proof. You have pointed to it, and it can be part of the board's deliberations.
And Madam Hearing Officer, one other point is that there are time limits on cross-examination. Mr. Domenici has already used up all of his time. And he has 6 witnesses or something like that. There's no reason to be, you know.
Right. I had forgotten that aspect of it, Mr. Domenici. You made full use of your cross-examination time of Ms. Miano, and I'm sorry, I keep forgetting about that. What is the nature of the other question you would ask?
The other question, again, is a brand-new issue that wasn't discussed, which was recycling or disposal of the lithium batteries.
Yes.
And I would like to follow up on her testimony and it'd be more precise.
And, all right, what would your question be?
Is a lithium battery hazardous waste once it's stopped its useful life?
Okay. Can that be outside the scope of this panel? There was an awful lot of discussion of the batteries, the possibility that they could be used for some other purpose, even if they couldn't be used to power a car. Is this something that is within your knowledge?
No.
Okay. Mr. Domenici, I think she's closed the door on that. You said you had the 2 questions.
So just to follow up on the battery, one more on the battery. Isn't it true, you described this, many other technologies where the technology doesn't really take into account the disposal or recycling costs. Isn't it true that the main objective with new technology is that the price reflect the disposal costs? So the government does not have to bear it, and the taxpayers who aren't benefiting from that piece of technology do not bear it, but the user pays the cost. Isn't
That sounds closer to what you were testifying about.
My testimony is that the cost of a vehicle does not account for externalities that the government has to bear for the lifetime of that vehicle, whether it be health costs to our New Mexico residents, environmental costs to our New Mexico residents, or environmental costs or cleanup costs, for example, in the Petroleum Storage Tank Bureau of the New Mexico Environment Department.
But if you know the cost or realize there's going to be a cost, isn't it true you try to incorporate it? Or if you're going to pass it on to the manufacturer, as you indicated, isn't it true the cost has to be included in the price of that item?
I wish that was the case, but it's not. The government cleans up a lot of waste from business and is very experienced in whether it be, like we have been discussing, spills, oil spills, gas emissions, climate emissions, all of the testimony from involving health impacts from air pollutants. All of these externalities are not included in the cost of a vehicle.
So the government is going to...
Mr. Domenici, I think you've
Okay,
pursued the 2
I'll move on.
points.
I had one question for Mr. Kopal, based
Okay.
on the questioning of Vice Chair. You talked about a baseline in one of the tables she referred to, and you compared the cost, and I think you said they would probably be, this was the 1.3 billion, 1 to 1.3 billion, and you were asked where those costs or benefits might show up, and I think you said it was not local, it was perhaps national or international, correct?
Yes.
And then on that particular analysis, in order to show that benefit differential, you had to compare it to a baseline.
Correct.
Is that the same baseline that Dr. Charlton discussed last night?
Can you refresh me on the baseline, Dr.
He said,
Shelton?
Right. So, Mr. Domenici, I'm sorry. Now,
I'll lay the foundation. I thought he'd heard.
Wasting time. He's already used more than his allotted time.
excuse me, I'm sorry. Mr. Domenici, I think Mr. Charlton described what his baseline was. I believe Mr. Kopal described his baseline. They both discussed it. And you can make whatever arguments you'd like to make on the differences. I can't hear you, Mr. Bach, unless you're at the podium. So if you would, please, we need a break. We're going to take a short break.
Madam Hearing Officer, I would ask that this time of excess cross-examination be deducted from the move-in interveners' time, because this is just, we have 4 witnesses that still need to go on, and this is just not appropriate.
All right, thank you, Mr. Bach. Mr. Domenici, we have to bring this to a close.
I'll just make my statement on the record. When new issues are brought up by the board that cannot be anticipated by council, to deprive the parties of cross-examination on those brand-new issues is a violation of due process.
Okay, and I was trying to balance that.
And I think you did, and I appreciate it.
All right, thank you very much. Let's take a 10-minute break. And you're excused, panel.